Have you ever trusted someone so deeply only to find out they were the ones pulling the knife behind your back? Edward Harrison's voice trembled as he stared out the rain-streaked window, the weight of betrayal crushing his chest like an unforgiving storm. The man who once commanded boardrooms and sealed multi-million-dollar deals was now a prisoner of fierce suspicion, gnawing at every thought. His life, built on years of relentless ambition and precision, was unraveling piece by piece, friends turning foes, secrets leaking like poison, and a little girl named Sophie thrust into the chaos, her innocence both a beacon of hope and a dangerous liability. Edward's heart pounded with a mix of fury, guilt, and desperate determination. Could he protect her? Could he survive the onslaught coming for both of them? If you think this is just another story about corporate betrayal, think again. What happens next will shatter every expectation and pull you into a world where trust is deadly and courage is the only weapon. Stay with me, because what Edward faces will shock you to your core. Edward Harrison stepped out of the sleek glass tower on Park Avenue, the chill winter air slicing through his expensive wool coat like invisible knives. The city around him was alive with distant honks, flickering street lamps, and the steady rhythm of hurried footsteps on wet pavement. But Edward barely noticed the world. At 52, he had built an empire from scratch, a financial fortress no one dared to challenge. Yet tonight, as he hurried toward his black Mercedes, something primal stirred in his gut, a cold, creeping unease that no amount of money or power could soothe. He unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of Italian leather wrapping around him like a shield. Normally, this moment was a breath of relief, a brief escape from deals numbers and endless negotiations. But tonight, the silence inside the car was broken by a soft, ice-cold touch against his lips. A small hand, frail, trembling, clamped gently but firmly over his mouth. His heart slammed in his chest. Panic flooded his veins as a whisper, barely audible but urgent, brushed his ear. "Don't say a word, Mr. Harrison. They're listening." Edward's breath caught. He twisted slowly in his seat, eyes wide with disbelief and rising fear. There, huddled in the back seat, was a little girl no older than 6. Her eyes were wide and glistening, filled with a terror no child should ever know. Dirt streaked her cheeks, and her ragged clothes spoke of nights spent without shelter. The city's lights blurred outside as Edward processed the impossible. Who was this girl? How had she gotten into his car? And what did she mean by their listening? "I don't understand." Edward stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The girl's gaze never wavered. "They put a mic in your car. They know where you go. They're going to make you crash." A shiver raced down Edward's spine. "Who?" he asked, voice shaking, despite his best efforts to sound calm. "The men in black suits," she answered softly, eyes darting nervously to the shadows beyond the window. "They talk about you all the time. They want you gone. I heard them at the abandoned house where I sleep." The word struck Edward like a blow. Men in black suits. This was no vague threat, it was a calculated, cold conspiracy. A nightmare come to life for a man who had always controlled every detail of his life. He inhaled deeply, fighting the rising tide of panic and disbelief. This tiny girl, a stranger, was telling him secrets that could cost him everything. His company, his reputation, even his life. "Why? Why are you telling me this?" he asked, voice thick with confusion and awe. The girl's lip quivered. "Because you were kind to me. You gave me food last week when it was raining. I heard them say your name, and I had to warn you." Edward's mind raced back to that day, a cold afternoon, when he'd spotted a small figure shivering near his office building. Without hesitation, he had handed her a sandwich and some cash, barely thinking twice. Now that small act of kindness had drawn this child into his dangerous world. Suddenly, headlights flickered on the street, and Edward's blood turned cold. Through the windshield, he spotted a tall man in a dark suit standing under a street lamp, eyes locked onto the car with unnerving focus. The predator was already circling. The car door rattled as someone approached, slow, deliberate footsteps growing louder. "We have to leave now," Edward whispered urgently. The girl nodded, shrinking into the narrow space between the front and back seats. Edward's hands trembled as he started the engine. The soft growl of the Mercedes seemed deafening in the tense silence. The man outside paused, then quickened his pace. Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself. He wasn't just fighting for a business deal anymore. He was fighting for survival and for the life of a child who had risked everything to save him. As he navigated the slick streets, Edward's mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination. His carefully ordered life was unraveling before his eyes. But beneath the panic, a strange resolve began to form. He was no longer alone. Just then, as they rounded a corner, a black sedan suddenly blocked their path, forcing Edward to slam the brakes. Time seemed to freeze as he assessed the threat. But years of experience took over. With a sharp swerve and a controlled burst of speed, Edward maneuvered the car away from danger. Inside the car, Sophie's small hand gripped his arm. "You're brave," she whispered. Edward's throat tightened. Here was this tiny, fearless girl whose street smarts and courage outshone even the most hardened players in his world. And here he was, a man used to power now learning to lean on the hope and strength of a child. As they sped into the city's tangled maze, Edward realized the battle ahead would test every ounce of his will. But with Sophie beside him, he wasn't ready to give up. I'm pausing the story here, and I'd love to know, if you were in Edward's shoes, how would you handle the shock of discovering someone so close to you is plotting your downfall? Would you trust the warnings of a stranger, especially a child? Let me know your thoughts below. If you're intrigued and want to see what happens next, please drop a like and share your heart with us by hitting that button. Your support means the world and helps keep the story alive. Stay tuned for the next part, where the shadows of betrayal deepen and the fight for survival becomes even more desperate. Edward's breath still came in short, sharp bursts as he eased the car away from the shadowed streets of Park Avenue, the weight of Sophie's words settling like a stone in his chest. The city that had once felt like a stage for his triumphs now felt like a labyrinth of threats and whispers. But there was no time to dwell. A new chapter of this nightmare was unfolding faster than he could process. Back in his sprawling suburban mansion, the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, Edward felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut. The moment he crossed the threshold, something was off. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was ominous. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in his ears. Every shadow seemed to flicker with hidden intent. He made his way to his private study, where he kept the most sensitive company documents. The soft glow of his laptop screen was the only light in the room. As he sifted through emails, contracts, and financial reports, a horrifying truth emerged. Hidden folders he never created contained detailed surveillance records, photos tracking his every move, voice recordings from his private calls, daily reports on his schedule. His home had been turned into a fortress of espionage. But the deepest wound came when Edward stumbled upon an audio file dated just 2 days prior. It was a conversation between Marcus Collins, his closest friend and business partner for over 15 years, and Carla Mitchell, his trusted personal secretary. The betrayal hung heavy in their words. Plans were underway to transfer company assets to offshore accounts, discredit Edward by fabricating mental instability, and strip him of everything he had built. Edward's hands trembled as he listened to Carla's cold voice. When he signs the contract Thursday, it'll all be over. He'll be bankrupt, broken, and locked away where no one will hear his protests. The room spun. 15 years of loyalty shattered in a single chilling moment. The man he had considered a brother was orchestrating his ruin, and the woman he had trusted implicitly was his greatest conspirator. A sharp knock broke Edward's thoughts. Frozen, he hid behind the heavy curtains just as Carla entered the study, her eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. She spoke aloud as if Edward weren't there, taunting him with every step. 8 years of pretending to care, and this is how it ends. How easy it was to convince Marcus Debt's desperation. He's just a pawn, but a useful one. Edward's heart thundered in his chest. He longed to step out, confront her scream. But logic warned otherwise. She had weapons allies in the upper hand. In the back of his mind, a small voice reminded him of Sophie waiting in the Midtown Inn, vulnerable and alone. He couldn't let this darkness swallow them both. Later that night, Edward returned to the hotel. The relief was short-lived. Sophie's room was empty. Panic surged as he found a hastily scrawled note written in the shaky handwriting of a frightened child. "Uncle Edward, they came for me. I heard them talk. They're taking me to the abandoned house by Viaduct 3. They're waiting for you too. Don't be scared. You taught me that good people always find a way. I love you like a real dad. Sophie." His breath caught. Sophie had escaped, but at what cost? The note was a lifeline, but also a trap. The abandoned house in Brooklyn was notorious a place where hope went to die. Edward's mind raced. The note bore a subtle mark, a faint number 3 barely visible. A clue. Sophie had risked everything to leave it. Driven by a surge of protective fury, Edward left the hotel without hesitation. As he neared Viaduct 3, the city's decay pressed in broken sidewalks, graffiti-stained walls, flickering streetlights. His pulse quickened. From a distance, he spotted the old 2-story house, windows boarded, weeds choking the yard. 2 dark cars were parked out front, silhouettes moving behind makeshift curtains. Edward's every sense heightened. He circled the block, noting patrol patterns, guard rotations. Sophie's keen observations flashed in his memory. One guard often nodded off another car, left briefly for supplies. Carefully, Edward found a partially open basement window. The stale smell of dampness greeted him as he slipped inside, moving silently through dust-covered boxes and shattered furniture. Upstairs, muffled voices and the faintest sobbing reached his ears. Heart-pounding, Edward ascended the creaky stairs, avoiding worn planks that threatened to betray him. Peering through a crack in a door, he saw Marcus talking on the phone, agitated, while Sophie sat huddled in a corner, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but eyes fierce with resolve. Their gazes met, a silent exchange of hope and determination. Edward's mind flashed back to the moment when Sophie had first confided in him. "I'm scared," she whispered, "but I'm not giving up, because you believe in me." In that instant, Edward felt the crushing weight of years spent chasing power and money lift, replaced by something raw and real, the fierce love for a child who had become his reason to fight. Suddenly, footsteps thundered from below. Voices shouted orders. The men were returning. Sophie grabbed Edward's sleeve. "Hide. When I say now, you run to the window. Don't look back." Minutes stretched like hours as they crouched in silence. The front door slammed open, boots marched up the stairs. A rough voice barked, "Where's the girl?" "Check every room." Edward pressed a finger to his lips. Sophie squeezed his hand. The door creaked open, then closed again. The search had missed them for now. Edward's mind raced with escape plans, every scenario weighed against impossible odds. Suddenly, chaos erupted. Sophie slipped out of the hiding spot, running silently as Edward created a diversion, confronting Marcus in the dim kitchen. Enough, Edward's voice rang with authority and desperation. "Let her go. I'll cooperate." Marcus sneered, eyes hard as steel. "You're finished, Edward. No deals." But Edward held firm, his every breath a battle between fear and hope. At that moment, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Police were coming. Sophie's quick thinking had paid off. She had managed to call for help before being captured. The room filled with tension as the criminals weighed their options. The inevitable collapse of their plan loomed. Edward's gaze met Sophie's, shining with gratitude and renewed strength. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for justice, redemption, and family. I'm sorry to pause here, but sometimes stories need a breath, a moment to let the emotions settle before plunging back into the storm. I want to ask you, if you were Edward, how would you balance the desire for revenge with the need to protect Sophie? Would you risk everything for justice or find another way? Please share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and send some love with a heart. Your support means everything and keeps this journey alive. Stay with me for the next part, where the final battle unfolds and lives are forever changed. As the piercing wail of sirens drew nearer, Edward felt the weight of the moment settle upon him like a crushing storm. This was the climax, the point where every choice, every risk, every ounce of courage would be tested. He took a steadying breath, glancing at Sophie. Her small hand fit perfectly into his, her eyes reflecting the fierce determination that had carried them this far. They moved silently through the dilapidated house, the shadows thick with danger. Edward's mind raced, replaying every detail Sophie had shared: the guards' rotations, the creaky basement window, the path least expected. Each step was a gamble, but surrender was no longer an option. The scent of damp wood and decay filled their senses as they crept toward the basement escape route. Suddenly, the sharp click of a gun being cocked echoed behind them. Edward spun, heart-pounding, to face Carla Mitchell, eyes wild, pistol trained steadily. "Going somewhere!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. Edward raised his hand slowly, voice calm but firm. Let the child go, Carla. This ends now. Carla laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the cracked walls. You think you've won? You don't even know the half of it. Before Edward could respond, Sophie slipped from his grasp, darting past Carla with surprising speed. Now she shouted, voice echoing with the bravery of a warrior. Edward lunged after her, the two weaving through the cluttered basement as footsteps thundered from above. A barrage of voices called out orders, confusion rippling through the kidnappers as police lights flashed outside the boarded windows. The final moments were a blur of adrenaline and sheer willpower. Edward shielded Sophie behind him as officers stormed the house, weapons drawn. Carla and Marcus were taken into custody, their schemes unraveling under the weight of evidence. Sophie had bravely gathered recordings, observations, and her own unwavering spirit. In the weeks that followed, life blossomed anew. Edward's mansion was no longer a fortress of loneliness, but a home filled with laughter and light. Sophie's once dirty clothes were replaced by vibrant dresses, her eyes bright with hope rather than fear. Edward found healing not in ledgers or contracts, but in the simple joys of fatherhood, bedtime stories, scraped knees, kissed better, and the soft warmth of a hand held tightly in his own. He supported Sophie's mother, Aunt Mary, as she recovered, ensuring a stable, loving environment for the family Sophie deserved. The trauma they endured didn't vanish overnight, but with time, trust, and unconditional love, wounds began to mend. Edward realized that true strength wasn't in dominance or wealth, but in vulnerability and connection. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Sophie tugged Edward to a small garden she'd planted, tender shoots breaking through rich earth, a symbol of new beginnings. Look, Dad, she said softly. They're flowers. Aunt Mary said they'll bloom beautiful just like us. Edward smiled, heartful. Yes, Sophie, just like us. As twilight embraced them, Edward reflected on the journey from betrayal to redemption, from fear to family. Sophie's courage had not only saved his life, but had given him the chance to rediscover his own humanity. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Edward's position, facing such overwhelming betrayal and danger? And how do you think Sophie's bravery changed the course of their lives? Tell me what you think of this story. If you loved it, comment with number 3 below. If you feel it needs improvement, comment number 1. And if you found it just okay, comment number 2. Also, share with me, where in the world are you watching from? Don't forget to like, send some hearts, and share this video to keep these stories alive and inspire others. Thank you for joining this journey.